Imagine you've spent years of your life studying, researching, and fighting for one cause. A cause that could change everything. A cure. Not a treatment, not a temporary fix, but a real cure for one of the deadliest, most feared diseases in the world. AIDS. A disease that has claimed millions of lives, broken countless families, and devastated entire communities. You're not a doctor. You don't wear a white coat. You haven't spent years in medical school. But you know something they don't. Something they've overlooked. The cure you've discovered isn't in the laboratories of pharmaceutical giants, it's not in the sterile halls of prestigious medical institutions. No. You found it, using the simplest, most natural remedies, a diet rooted in something the world has forgotten. You found the key to ending this epidemic once and for all. Every test, every patient you've treated confirms it. You've done it. You've found the answer. But then, something happens. The phone calls stop. The offers for help disappear. Your supporters, once enthusiastic and loyal, begin to doubt. They start to call you a fraud, a madman. And before you know it, the very system you thought you were helping, the system that's supposed to help the sick, turns against you. You're branded a threat. Your research is discredited. Your findings are called dangerous. The world, it seems, is terrified of what you've discovered. And the worst part? You're alone. Alone in your fight for the truth. But what if this wasn't just coincidence? What if there were forces at work, powers too big to challenge, who needed you to stop? What if your discovery was so dangerous to the very fabric of society that someone, or something, needed to make sure it was erased? This isn't just a story about a cure. It's about what happens when one person dares to stand against the machine. What happens when someone doesn't just challenge the system, but threatens the foundations of everything we've been told about health, medicine, and the treatment of disease. Imagine, for a moment, that everything you've known about medicine, health, and the pharmaceutical industry is wrong. Imagine that the cure to AIDS was hidden from the world. Imagine that the solution to a global health crisis wasn't locked behind expensive treatments, endless medications, or decades of research, but instead, it was something simple, natural, and affordable. What happens when a man comes forward with this discovery? What happens when he dares to expose the truth about a cure that the world wasn't ready to accept? The cure wasn't just a threat to the medical community, it was a threat to something far greater. It wasn't just about a disease anymore. It became about money. It became about control. It became about a world where the truth wasn't something people wanted to hear. And for someone who tried to bring that truth to light, the cost was higher than anyone could imagine. Now picture this, you've worked your entire life for this. You've put your heart and soul into your discovery, and you've helped people, real people, who have seen miraculous results. But now, you're being watched. People around you are changing. Friends are turning into foes. And the more you push forward, the more you realize, you're not just fighting to change medicine, you're fighting to survive. But what happens when the system you're fighting against turns its full power on you? It's hard to believe, but it's true, this man, who should have been celebrated, became a target. His name was erased from the records. His work was dismissed as quackery. And despite the overwhelming evidence, his discovery was buried, forgotten. Not because it didn't work, but because it was too much of a threat to the existing order. And then, there's the question no one dares to ask, was he silenced? The truth is, we may never know. Because the answers are hidden, and the pieces of the puzzle are scattered. The man who claimed to have cured AIDS disappeared, and with him, the truth. His name might not sound familiar to you right now, but by the end of this video, you will understand why his story was never meant to be told. You'll understand why he became a target, why his discovery was erased, and why his life ended in a way that makes everyone involved in this story question everything they thought they knew about power, truth, and survival. Did he really find the cure? If he did, why hasn't the world heard more about it? And most chilling of all, who benefited from keeping this discovery a secret? The story we're about to uncover is more than just the tale of a man who challenged the medical system. It's a story of a man who dared to expose the truth at any cost. It's a story about health, corruption, and what happens when a single discovery threatens to unravel everything we've been told about medicine. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about one person's life, it's about the lives of all of us. It's about how far some will go to protect their interests, and how dangerous the truth can be when it's buried. By the end of this video, you'll know the name of the man who was erased from history. And you'll understand why his discovery was a game changer. But was it too dangerous for the world to accept? The world has been grappling with AIDS for over 4 decades. Since its emergence in the early 1980s, HIV/AIDS has claimed the lives of more than 36 million people globally. The disease has left a trail of devastation, not just in terms of health, but also in the emotional and social toll it has taken on families, communities, and nations. Entire generations of people have been wiped out in the blink of an eye. And even as medical science has made advances, the disease still looms large, its grip tightening in many parts of the world. AIDS is not just a medical crisis, it's a social and psychological one as well. The stigma surrounding the disease has been brutal. For many, a diagnosis is not just a death sentence, it's a sentence of isolation. Those living with HIV have faced discrimination, ostracization, and marginalization. Even today, in 2024, HIV/AIDS continues to be a public health challenge, particularly in developing countries where resources for proper care and prevention are scarce. In the years following its emergence, pharmaceutical companies quickly capitalized on the global crisis, offering a range of treatments known as antiretroviral therapies. These drugs, while life-saving, were costly and became a major revenue source for Big Pharma. The cost of these medications became a point of contention, with many people unable to afford the ongoing treatment that could prolong their lives. The reality was that for many, the pills they were forced to take weren't a cure, they were a means of slowing down the inevitable. And the profits? They were staggering. The industry wasn't about to let go of its hold on the disease. After all, AIDS was a cash cow. So, when someone comes forward claiming they have a cure, something that could make all of that money, and all the power tied to it, disappear, it becomes clear that what we're dealing with here isn't just a scientific breakthrough. It's a threat. A threat to one of the most lucrative industries on Earth. Now, let's step back for a moment and look at the broader landscape of medicine during this period. You have an entire population desperate for answers. People who have seen loved ones die, watched as their friends lost their battles with AIDS, and who have nowhere to turn but to the harsh chemicals prescribed to them by doctors and pharmaceutical companies. And then, into this landscape steps someone claiming to have the solution. He is not a well-established figure in the world of science. He is not from a prestigious university or a renowned medical institution. He is, by all accounts, an outsider, a man with a message that challenges everything we've been told about health, medicine, and disease. This man wasn't a doctor, at least not in the traditional sense. He had no formal training in medical science, no degree from a prestigious university, no clinical trials or peer-reviewed studies to back his claims. But he had something else, a vision. He had a belief that health wasn't just about medicine, that true wellness could be found in nature, through plants, herbs, and food that had been ignored or forgotten by mainstream science. He claimed that the body, when treated right, could heal itself. And not just from minor ailments. He said he had a cure for some of the world's most debilitating diseases, diseases that mainstream medicine had no answer for, or could only manage with expensive treatments. For decades, the scientific community had been at a loss when it came to AIDS. Despite billions of dollars in research, treatments were merely palliative, not curative. People continued to die. Desperation set in. And then, one man claimed he had found the answer. He said the solution was simple, even elegant. It wasn't hidden in laboratories or complex pharmaceutical compounds. The key was in diet, specifically, a plant-based, alkaline diet that could cleanse the body, strengthen the immune system, and eliminate disease. He preached about the healing power of nature. He said that the body's natural ability to fight disease could be unleashed with the right foods, and that it wasn't just AIDS that could be cured, it was diabetes, high blood pressure, even cancer. It sounded like a miracle. Could it really be true? Could someone, without a degree or a lab coat, have figured out what some of the brightest minds in the world had failed to do? This man's claims were as radical as they were controversial. Many dismissed him outright, calling his ideas pseudoscience, and even worse, dangerous. Mainstream medical practitioners ridiculed him, claiming that his approach was nothing more than quackery. But his followers weren't swayed. They weren't just listening to him because they wanted a quick fix, they were listening because they had seen the results. People who were told they had no hope were finding new hope in this man's message. People with HIV and AIDS began to report feeling better after following his regimen. They said they had more energy, fewer symptoms, and some claimed to have even reversed their diagnoses. For many, this wasn't just about physical health, it was about reclaiming a sense of dignity, of control over their bodies in a world that had so often made them feel powerless. But this growing following made him an even bigger target. In a world where money and power shaped the medical landscape, this outsider was a threat. He was a threat to an entire industry built on the back of disease. And the more successful his approach became, the more desperate his enemies would become. What happens when a man's ideas are so dangerous to the establishment that they will do anything to stop him? What happens when he challenges the very foundations of medicine and calls into question everything we've been told about health and disease? His critics were not silent, and soon, the story would take a dark turn, one that no one could have predicted. As he continued to promote his healing methods, the stakes only grew higher, and the authorities began to take notice. But who was this man? What was his true purpose? And how far would those in power go to silence him? As we continue, we will unravel the shocking truth, one that exposes not just the system's ruthlessness, but the lengths to which it will go to protect its interests. And remember, his identity is still a mystery, for now. The healer, known by many names, but never fully understood by the world, emerged at a time when hope was running thin. For years, doctors, researchers, and pharmaceutical giants had promised breakthroughs in the battle against HIV/AIDS, cancer, diabetes, and a range of chronic diseases. Yet, the treatments offered were often nothing more than temporary solutions, at best, or outright failures, at worst. The medical system that had been built up to combat these diseases seemed to have no answers, and for those living with these illnesses, it seemed like there was no escape from the endless cycle of prescribed drugs and failed treatments. Then came a man with no degree, no traditional credentials, and no institutional backing, yet he dared to challenge everything the world had been told about medicine. He called himself the healer, though he never asked for fame, and his message resonated with a growing number of individuals desperate for answers. The healer's approach wasn't rooted in the expensive medicines that had been sold to patients for decades. He didn't believe in the chemically laden pills prescribed by the pharmaceutical industry. Instead, he preached about a return to nature, a return to the natural way of healing that, he claimed, had been buried and ignored by modern medicine. He said that the body could heal itself through proper diet and the right plant-based remedies. And it wasn't just small, manageable ailments that he claimed to cure. No, he said he could cure the world's most feared diseases. The healer's message was simple yet profound: AIDS, diabetes, cancer, these diseases, and many more, could be reversed or cured altogether. His words ignited hope in the hearts of those who had been abandoned by conventional medicine. For the first time in years, they had something tangible to hold on to. It was a light in the darkness. A chance to live, to be free from the clutches of a disease that had stolen so many lives. But such groundbreaking claims don't come without consequences. As the healer's following grew, so did the skepticism. For every person who found hope in his teachings, there were others who questioned his methods. They demanded evidence. They wanted proof. Skeptics pointed to the lack of scientific research backing his claims and criticized him for offering hope without any clinical trials or peer-reviewed studies. Was it possible that he had really discovered a cure for AIDS? Or was he simply playing on the desperation of the sick and dying to make a name for himself? The public was divided. On one side, there were the believers, the people who had turned to the healer in their darkest hour, the ones who claimed their lives had changed, that they felt better, healthier, more alive than they had in years. They saw their ailments vanish, their health restored. And on the other side, there were the critics, the scientists, the doctors, the pharmaceutical industry, and the media who questioned his credibility and motivations. They saw his claims as nothing more than false hope, a dangerous lie. But the healer was undeterred. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. His message became more direct, more challenging. He didn't just offer a cure, he offered an indictment of the system itself. He accused the pharmaceutical industry of suppressing natural cures in order to maintain their monopoly on healthcare. He pointed to the billions of dollars spent annually on drugs and treatments that only managed symptoms, never curing the disease. Why wasn't there a cure for AIDS, for cancer, for diabetes, if the medical community truly cared about saving lives? The healer's message was bold and accusatory. He claimed the pharmaceutical giants had buried the truth to protect their profits. According to him, the true cure for these diseases had been right under our noses all along, but the system wasn't interested in finding it. They were interested in controlling it. They wanted customers, not cures. His accusations were explosive, and they sent shockwaves through the medical world. For the first time, someone was speaking out in a way that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just advocating for a different approach to health, he was calling out the very foundation of the healthcare system. He was challenging everything we had been told to believe about medicine. He dared to ask, why hadn't we found a cure for AIDS? Why were millions of people still dying from diseases that the medical industry claimed to be studying tirelessly? His voice, once that of an outsider, now echoed in the halls of academia and boardrooms, where people from the pharmaceutical industry were forced to listen. His message spread like wildfire, drawing in followers from every corner of the globe. People traveled far and wide to hear the healer speak, to try his methods, to believe in the possibility of a cure that could change everything. But while the healer inspired many, he also angered powerful forces. He had made enemies, many of them wealthy and influential. The pharmaceutical industry was not one to take accusations lightly. If what he said was true, then it could unravel their entire business model. After all, their profit margins depended on maintaining the status quo, the idea that these diseases were incurable, that people needed expensive treatments for the rest of their lives. And so, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, you had a man who claimed to have found the truth, who spoke out against a system he believed was exploiting the sick for profit. On the other, you had an industry built on profits and power, a system that had existed for decades, with deep ties to governments, hospitals, and research institutions. What happened when these two forces collided? The healer was not just calling out an industry, he was calling out the very systems of power that held sway over healthcare. He dared to challenge the fundamental narrative that people had been living under for generations. And the more he pushed, the more the stakes grew. He wasn't just threatening an industry, he was threatening an entire worldview. A worldview where medicine was something you bought, not something you healed. As the world watched, the healer's claims continued to spark debate, controversy, and, eventually, alarm. Who was this man? What was his true agenda? Was he the savior he claimed to be, or was he simply a con artist playing on the vulnerabilities of the desperate and the sick? The healer knew the risks. He knew the power of the forces he was up against. And yet, he pressed on, determined to challenge the status quo. But in doing so, he had set a dangerous course in motion, a course that would eventually lead to a fateful confrontation. A confrontation that would change everything. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the mystery that surrounds the healer's claims and the shocking events that followed. The questions that remain unanswered are chilling. Was he truly the man who discovered the cure to AIDS, or was he silenced by those who stood to lose everything? His story, one of hope, betrayal, and power, continues to unfold. Despite the widespread support from those who believed in the healer's methods, it didn't take long for the legal system and regulatory bodies to intervene. When someone steps outside the bounds of established science and challenges the medical establishment, the reaction is almost always the same: scrutiny, suspicion, and often, persecution. The healer, who had gained international attention for his controversial claims, soon found himself in a battle that wasn't just about medicine or science, it was about survival. As his influence expanded, so did the power and reach of the institutions that were threatened by his existence. They had fought against smaller threats before, but this time was different. This time, they were up against someone who dared to question the very core of modern medicine. It wasn't long before the first legal challenge surfaced. Government agencies, such as the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, took notice of the healer's activities. After all, he wasn't just offering alternative remedies, he was boldly claiming that he could cure diseases that had stumped scientists for decades. Diseases that were heavily regulated and heavily profitable for the pharmaceutical industry. The FDA quickly began investigating his operations, accusing him of practicing medicine without a license, making false claims about the effectiveness of his treatments, and even attempting to sell unapproved drugs. At the heart of these legal proceedings was the question, was the healer's natural approach to healing truly a legitimate medical breakthrough, or was it a dangerous and misleading scam? The regulatory agencies took the stance that the healer's methods were unproven and potentially harmful. His critics, often from the medical and pharmaceutical communities, called him a fraud. They labeled his treatments as pseudoscience, dangerous for those who place their trust in his promises. But to the healer's supporters, this was nothing less than an attack on a man who had dared to challenge the status quo. They saw a system that valued profit over people, an industry that suppressed alternative cures because they threatened the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The healer wasn't just a man fighting for truth. To them, he was a David taking on a Goliath, a revolutionary trying to dismantle an unjust system that had been in place for decades. As legal cases piled up, the media took notice. Headlines across the country were filled with inflammatory statements, often casting the healer in a negative light. The press, often aligned with corporate interests, didn't shy away from painting him as a dangerous charlatan. He was accused of preying on vulnerable patients desperate for a cure. Investigative journalists followed him relentlessly, delving into every aspect of his life, often focusing on the sensational elements of his story rather than the medical claims themselves. But amidst the media frenzy, a stark divide began to form. On one side, the healer was a criminal, a fraudster who should be held accountable for putting people's lives at risk. On the other side, he was a hero, a man who had risked everything to tell the truth, to provide an alternative to the failed promises of the pharmaceutical industry. Supporters from all over the world rallied behind him, creating grassroots movements, sharing testimonials of miraculous recoveries, and accusing the media of smearing someone who had offered a real solution to humanity's biggest health crises. The persecution wasn't limited to legal battles or media scrutiny, it spread to physical threats as well. Rumors circulated that the healer had received death threats, that his clinics were being raided by authorities, and that he was constantly under surveillance. Despite the mounting pressure, the healer refused to back down. He saw his legal battles not as a setback but as a confirmation of the importance of his work. The attacks on him only proved that the system was afraid of the truth he was exposing. He had become, in his mind, a martyr, a man willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. But the story didn't stop there. Behind closed doors, the legal cases continued to pile up. The government sought to shut down his operation and stop his message from spreading any further. In some instances, authorities even attempted to arrest the healer on charges ranging from fraud to illegal business practices. These attempts seemed to intensify as the healer's network of followers expanded. It wasn't just his methods that were under attack, it was his very existence. The world was watching as this clash between the system and the healer unfolded. For every courtroom battle and media headline, the stakes grew higher. This wasn't just about proving a cure, it was about whether or not a man could change the world or be crushed under the weight of the institutions that had long controlled it. To many, this seemed like more than just a legal fight. It seemed like an ideological war, one where the healer's message was far too powerful to go unchallenged. Those in power knew that if his claims were true, it could unravel everything. The billions of dollars spent on HIV medications, cancer treatments, and diabetes drugs, if people no longer needed these, the economic consequences would be staggering. And the political and social ramifications? They would be even more profound. Who controlled healthcare? Who got to decide what treatments were available to the public? These questions would have to be answered. At this point, the healer had gained a significant following, one that was as committed to his message as his critics were to discrediting him. Followers not only traveled far to hear him speak, they also began to form their own networks of support, exchanging information and sharing their experiences of healing. For them, the healer wasn't just a man with a cure, he was the embodiment of a new future, a future free from the control of big pharma and traditional medicine. But as the healer's influence grew, so did the forces aligned against him. The pressure on him, both legally and personally, was mounting. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had already sacrificed so much, his reputation, his finances, and his peace of mind. Yet, he remained resolute. He believed in his work. He believed in the people who trusted him. But was it enough? Would he be able to withstand the full weight of the system coming after him? And as the legal battles continued, the healer's fate seemed to be hanging by a thread. The world was watching, but few knew how this story would unfold. Would he be silenced, or would the truth of his work eventually be acknowledged? But the questions didn't stop there. Was the healer truly the savior he claimed to be? Or was he a man so consumed by his beliefs that he couldn't see the consequences of his actions? And now, we ask you, who do you think this person could be? A fraud, or a revolutionary? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, as we continue to unravel the mystery surrounding one of the most controversial figures in modern history. Up until now, the healer had been a thorn in the side of the powerful forces that governed medicine, but as the pressure mounted, the tension reached a breaking point. The healer's once promising rise to prominence took a darker turn, as the forces he had spent years fighting against finally closed in. It all started with a routine visit to a government facility, at least, that's what he thought. Behind the scenes, however, the authorities were preparing to make their move. Rumors swirled that his arrest had been in the works for weeks. The healer, known for his public defiance of the pharmaceutical industry, was detained under mysterious circumstances. What began as a typical visit turned into something much darker when he was taken into custody without any prior warning. On the surface, the reasons behind his arrest were officially linked to an ongoing investigation into his business practices. But many believed there was much more to it. His enemies in the medical and pharmaceutical industries, as well as those in government, had long been seeking a way to silence him. The arrest came as no surprise to some, but to others, it was a shocking, sudden attack on the very idea of natural healing and alternative medicine. The strange circumstances surrounding his detainment began immediately. According to official reports, the healer was suffering from what was labeled as complications from pneumonia, a condition that took an unexpected and severe turn. The conflicting reports from various doctors only deepened the confusion. Was this truly an illness that had taken him by surprise, or was something far more sinister at play? The healer had been taken into custody just days before his death. And when news of his passing broke, it was shrouded in mystery. Official statements pointed to pneumonia as the cause, but many of his supporters were far from convinced. How could a man who had so carefully guarded his health and treated others with natural remedies succumb to such an illness? And why had no one been allowed to speak with him in the days leading up to his death? These were the questions that consumed his followers, who refused to believe that their beloved healer had simply fallen victim to a common disease. They believed there was more to his death than the public was being told. As details of his passing began to leak out, more questions emerged. The healer had been arrested, but why was he not given proper medical care while in custody? Why had he not been transported to a hospital for proper treatment? And why was the cause of death so suddenly and mysteriously ruled as pneumonia when it was clear that the healer's health had been well maintained? The inconsistencies in the reports only fueled speculation, and it wasn't long before the first whispers of foul play began to circulate. The rumors spread quickly. The healer, who had spent his life speaking out against the corrupting influence of the pharmaceutical industry, had become a martyr. Supporters of his work were certain that he hadn't died from an illness at all. Instead, they believed that he had been killed, silenced by the very system he had challenged for so long. Some claimed that he had been injected with a deadly substance while in police custody, while others pointed to the possibility that his health had been deliberately neglected as a form of punishment. It seemed impossible to shake the feeling that the authorities had taken drastic measures to ensure that he wouldn't be able to continue his mission. The more the supporters dug, the more they found that didn't add up. There were no clear answers as to why he had been arrested, why he had been denied access to proper medical care, or why his death had been so hastily and unexplainably categorized as pneumonia. The questions seemed endless. And yet, despite the mounting evidence of foul play, the mainstream media largely accepted the official story. To many, this only solidified the growing belief that the healer had been assassinated for his beliefs and for the knowledge he had dared to share with the world. The reaction from the public was one of outrage. Social media exploded with tributes, angry posts, and cries for justice. Supporters of the healer, those who had seen his methods transform lives, were convinced that his death was not a natural one. They pointed to the timing of his arrest, his sudden deterioration in custody, and the glaring inconsistencies in the medical reports. Was this really just a tragic accident, or had he been taken out to stop him from continuing his fight? Meanwhile, critics of the healer's methods, and those who had long questioned his credibility, seized on the opportunity to claim that his death was the inevitable result of a fraudulent career. They argued that his unorthodox practices had been bound to catch up with him eventually. To them, the healer had gotten what he deserved, the consequences of spreading lies to the vulnerable and the desperate. But his supporters refused to accept this. They rallied around his cause, calling for further investigations into the circumstances of his death, and many demanded that the government be held accountable for what they believed was murder. The theories surrounding his death grew darker and more complex. Some claimed that his death had been orchestrated by powerful pharmaceutical companies who saw him as a direct threat to their financial interests. Others suspected that government agencies had been involved in his death, fearing the revolutionary impact his natural cures could have on global health care. But the most convincing theory, at least to his followers, was that he had been silenced by the very system he had worked so tirelessly to expose. Amid the uproar, details began to emerge that hinted at the true nature of the healer's background, diet philosophy, and his unyielding opposition to conventional medicine. Born in a time of great medical advances, yet raised in an environment where natural healing was still the norm, he had long been disillusioned with the healthcare system. His journey began as an unlikely outsider, a person who rejected the mainstream medical system that treated symptoms without addressing the root causes of disease. His work was based on the belief that true healing came from within, through diet, lifestyle, and natural remedies. He had spoken often of his own struggles with conventional medicine and how he had worked to develop an alternative path. He wasn't just a healer, he was a revolutionary. He questioned everything. He called out those in power for exploiting the sick and making fortunes off of treatments that did nothing to address the real issues. He advocated for fasting, herbal medicine, and a plant-based diet as the true path to health, not the expensive, often harmful pharmaceuticals that were sold to the public. His teachings had struck a chord with millions, but they also put him on a collision course with some of the most powerful industries in the world. As the world processed the loss of the healer, the questions lingered. How did such a promising and controversial figure meet such a tragic end? Was his death a mere coincidence, or was it a calculated move by those threatened by his message? The world may never know the full truth, but the unanswered questions are what linger in the minds of those who knew the healer and those who continue to seek the truth. As the world grappled with the shocking death of the healer, the theories surrounding his passing began to multiply, each one more alarming than the last. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just about what had happened, but why it had happened. Was his death merely a tragic turn of fate, or was it part of something much larger? Theories began to emerge, some far more plausible than others, but all carrying the weight of suspicion and distrust in the systems that governed our health. One of the most widely circulated theories was that the healer had been silenced by the very industry he had spent his life challenging, the pharmaceutical industry. For decades, this powerful sector had profited immensely from chronic diseases, including AIDS, cancer, and diabetes. These were conditions that had long been treated with medications that kept patients dependent, often for life. But the healer's natural remedies promised something the pharmaceutical giants could not afford: a cure, a complete and lasting remedy. If his methods were proven to work, they would render the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry obsolete. Pharmaceutical companies, many believed, would not have allowed such a cure to go unchallenged. After all, medicine was big business. And the idea that a single individual could offer a real, non-commercial solution to some of the world's deadliest diseases was simply too dangerous to ignore. The public outcry following his death was matched by claims that he had been intentionally removed from the public eye, the authorities complicit in ensuring that his message never reached a global stage. It wasn't hard to imagine the lengths to which pharmaceutical giants might go to protect their profits. Several supporters of the healer began to connect the dots. They pointed to the series of events leading up to his death, his sudden arrest, the conflicting reports about his health, and the lack of proper medical care while in custody. They argued that this was a deliberate attempt to discredit him, to make sure his message didn't spread further. The healer had been outspoken against the greed of pharmaceutical companies for years, calling out what he saw as the exploitation of the sick for profit. If he had truly found a cure, then it was clear why they would want him gone. His death, to them, wasn't just a coincidence, it was an assassination of sorts, carried out to protect the interests of the powerful, with the government serving as their willing partner. This theory resonated deeply with his supporters, many of whom had already felt the sting of corporate-driven healthcare systems. The idea that they were being kept in the dark about cures that could change their lives wasn't just a hypothetical. Many people had experienced the high costs of medications that treated only symptoms, never the root cause. The healer had challenged this system, and for that, they believed, he had been targeted. But for every theory that pointed to foul play, there were others who insisted that the healer's death was the result of something far simpler, bad health, or just a tragic series of events. Critics of the healer's methods were quick to point out that his diet and lifestyle might not have been as sustainable as he had claimed. He had long advocated for extreme detox regimens, fasting, and a strict plant-based diet. Was it possible that this radical approach to health had backfired? Some suggested that the healer had simply overexerted himself, pushed his body too hard, and ultimately succumbed to an illness. The conflicting medical reports regarding his pneumonia diagnosis fueled this speculation. Could it have been that his immune system, weakened by years of fasting and extreme detoxing, had left him vulnerable to a simple illness that spiraled out of control? There were also those who argued that the timing of his arrest and subsequent health decline was purely coincidental. Could he have just been unlucky? After all, pneumonia was not an uncommon illness, especially for someone who was in his later years. And while his supporters were convinced that there was a conspiracy to silence him, the skeptics saw his death as a tragic reminder that even the most well-meaning individuals could fall victim to the harsh realities of aging and illness. As these two theories clashed, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. The healer's death had become a battleground for conflicting beliefs about health, truth, and power. The public was divided, with some seeing him as a martyr, while others viewed him as an eccentric figure who had ultimately paid the price for his unconventional methods. But even as these questions swirled, there was one thing that was undeniable: the healer had become a symbol. He was a symbol of defiance against the status quo, and his death had become an emblem of the larger struggle for medical autonomy. Theories surrounding the healer's death didn't exist in a vacuum. Over the years, there had been numerous other cases of alternative medicine practitioners who had died under mysterious circumstances, leading many to draw comparisons. Some of these deaths were more easily explained: heart attacks, accidents, or illnesses, but others had left lingering questions. The alternative health community, already suspicious of mainstream medicine, had long believed that the authorities were quick to dismiss these deaths as natural, even when the circumstances suggested otherwise. Take, for example, the case of other prominent figures in natural healing who had been targeted or had met untimely ends. There was the controversial holistic doctor, found dead under mysterious circumstances just after releasing a report on natural cancer cures that directly challenged the pharmaceutical industry. Another naturopathic doctor, who had been outspoken about the dangers of vaccines, was found dead in what seemed to be a suspicious drowning accident. The pattern was undeniable: alternative medicine practitioners, especially those who dared to challenge the status quo, often found themselves facing dangerous opposition. The idea that these deaths were mere coincidences was hard to accept for those who followed alternative medicine. They saw the sudden deaths of their heroes as more than just isolated events. They saw a troubling trend, a systemic effort to suppress anyone who threatened the multi-billion-dollar healthcare industry. At this point, the public began to connect the dots, and whispers of a larger conspiracy grew louder. Was the healer just another victim in a long line of suspicious deaths? Was his battle against the system doomed from the start? And if he had been silenced, who else would be next? Do you believe the healer was truly silenced by Big Pharma, or do you think his death was just a tragic coincidence? As the theories continued to unfold, the audience found themselves caught between disbelief and a growing understanding of the dangerous forces that might be at play. The healer's death had sparked a global conversation, one that raised larger questions about power, corruption, and the lengths to which some industries would go to protect their profits. And yet, amid the confusion and uncertainty, one thing was clear: the healer's legacy, whatever the truth of his death, was far from over. As the theories, the rumors, and the suspicions swirl, we've reached the point of no return. The time has come to unveil the truth, the person who dared to defy a system that has kept the world sick for centuries. The man whose work challenged the very foundation of modern medicine. The healer, the challenger, was none other than Dr. Sebi. The world knew him as a doctor, a herbalist, and a holistic healer, but his true identity was far more complex than any title could encompass. His name, Dr. Sebi, became synonymous with the fight for alternative medicine, and his teachings resonated with people across the globe who were desperate for answers to diseases that traditional medicine had failed to cure. The disease that he most famously claimed to cure, AIDS, was, in the eyes of many, the ultimate challenge to the medical establishment. His approach was radical: no drugs, no synthetic chemicals, only natural plants and herbs to heal the body. But in a world dominated by pharmaceutical giants, his message of empowerment was a threat, one that those in power could never allow to succeed. I am not a doctor in the traditional sense, but I am a healer. I don't treat symptoms, I heal the body. All diseases are rooted in mucus, and if you cleanse the body of mucus, you can reverse diseases like AIDS, diabetes, cancer. But that's not what they want you to know. Dr. Sebi's message was as profound as it was controversial. He wasn't just speaking about curing illnesses, he was challenging the very system that had long profited from the suffering of the sick. For decades, the pharmaceutical industry had made billions by treating symptoms, not cures. But Dr. Sebi was different. He wasn't selling pills or injections, he was selling freedom. He spoke of a world where people could heal themselves, without the need for costly medications that provided temporary relief, not lasting health. Dr. Sebi's legacy is a tangled web of hope, controversy, and defiance. To his supporters, he was nothing short of a hero. A visionary who saw what others couldn't or wouldn't, a cure for diseases that had plagued humanity for generations. His teachings resonated with people who had suffered for years under the heavy hand of the medical-industrial complex. They were the ones who had exhausted every traditional treatment, only to find their conditions worsening. They were the ones who turned to Dr. Sebi, not just for answers, but for hope, a hope that seemed unattainable in the face of modern medicine's failures. But for the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical giants, Dr. Sebi represented a threat to everything they had built. He wasn't just challenging their treatments, he was challenging their very profit model. By showing people that health could be restored through natural means, without costly prescriptions or lifelong dependency, he was undermining their entire business. And it was no surprise that those in power would stop at nothing to discredit him. He had already faced legal battles in Honduras, and his arrest in 2016 was seen by many as the final act of a long campaign to silence him. His sudden death in custody, unexplained, shrouded in conflicting reports, only fueled suspicions that his life had been taken to protect the interests of the powerful. But what is the true cost of defying a system that thrives on dependency? Dr. Sebi's life and death raise questions not just about healthcare, but about power, control, and freedom. Was he simply a quack, a man who believed in unproven methods? Or was he a pioneer, a martyr who gave his life to fight for the right to choose how we treat our bodies? In the years following his death, his supporters continued to share his message, and his name became a rallying cry for those who believed in the power of natural medicine. His herbal remedies, once dismissed as alternative, gained a following around the world, from Africa to the Americas, from Europe to the Caribbean. His vision of a world where people could heal themselves, where diseases could be conquered with plants and simple remedies, continues to inspire those who believe that traditional medicine is not the only path to wellness. Dr. Sebi was not just a healer, he was a symbol. A symbol of the underdog, fighting against a powerful system that had long been stacked against the people. His death, whether the result of natural causes or a targeted act, only magnified his message. The silence surrounding his passing raised more questions than it answered, and in the years since, the call for a more open, honest, and holistic approach to medicine has only grown stronger. But Dr. Sebi's story is far from over. His teachings are alive in the hearts of millions who continue to believe in the power of nature to heal. He wasn't just a man who found a cure, he was a man who found the courage to stand up against a system that sought to keep the truth buried. His fight continues in every person who questions the status quo, in every person who seeks an alternative to the mainstream. In the end, Dr. Sebi wasn't just challenging medicine, he was challenging us all to take control of our health, our bodies, and our lives. And as we reflect on his legacy, we are left with an important question: how far will we allow the systems in place to control us before we start looking for our own answers? Dr. Sebi's story is a reminder that the pursuit of truth, whether it's about health, freedom, or justice, often comes at a steep price. But it's also a reminder that no matter how powerful the forces may be that stand against us, there is always the possibility of change. Do you think Dr. Sebi's death was part of a greater conspiracy? Or was it the result of a natural tragedy? As the dust settles on his life and legacy, the truth may be harder to find than ever. But one thing is certain, Dr. Sebi's message will continue to echo, challenging the very foundations of our healthcare system and inspiring those who refuse to be silenced. As we close this chapter on Dr. Sebi's life and legacy, we're left with a haunting question that lingers in the air. Do you believe Dr. Sebi was silenced for his groundbreaking discoveries, or do you think the truth behind his death is less dramatic than it seems? His fight for natural cures, his unwavering challenge to the medical establishment, and his tragic end, was it the consequence of his controversial methods, or was there something darker at play? The truth may never be fully known, but the questions will continue to haunt us for years to come. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened to Dr. Sebi? Was he a martyr for a cause too great for the system to allow, or was his fate a tragic result of his personal choices? Maybe you have your own theory. Share your thoughts, your suspicions, and your beliefs in the comments below. This is the place for a conversation that needs to be had, and your voice matters in this unfolding narrative. And if this story left you questioning the truth, you're not alone. There are many more whistleblowers, many more untold stories of individuals who dared to stand up to the system, and whose sacrifices demand to be heard. If you want to dive deeper into these stories and uncover the secrets that powerful systems don't want you to know, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more gripping tales of whistleblowers, martyrs, and the fight for justice. Because the truth is out there, hidden in plain sight. And we're here to find it, together. Next time, we'll be bringing you the story of another whistleblower, another individual who challenged the powers that be, whose quest for truth cost them everything they had. You won't want to miss it. Stay tuned for the Whistleblower Files, the series that dares to uncover what others are too afraid to tell you. Until then, remember, the price of truth is often high, but the cost of ignorance is far greater.